And now, you're tuned into RBLR, the home of Tampa Bay's Reveler Sports.
Hello and welcome back to your RBLR Rays show. I am your host, Pat Davenport, and I am joined by Remy Bunakevich. Remy, what are you thankful for this holiday season?
Well, I guess I'm a little thankful that the Rays didn't have much news, so I could spend time with my family. But definitely thankful at this upcoming offseason, and hopefully, I'm thankful that Tyler Glasnow wasn't traded last week. What about you?
Oh, I'm extremely thankful for that because that would have been a whole kettle of fish. And personally, I would love the Rays to keep a hold of Glasnow unless something amazing happens. As a UK resident, I'm not well versed in the goings on of Thanksgiving. I believe it's something to do with a turkey and an egg-shaped football.
Yeah, something like that. And I think it was also like some sort of former like British colonists or something, and some like Native Americans getting together and celebrating a feast. But besides an egg-shaped football, I also know about something called a baseball. That's right, and it's something you can throw
Mm.
hard, and something that our first topic does really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I want to just say that we at RBLR are extremely thankful for. It's you, the audience, for tuning in today and every other week. If you're new, welcome. If you're here again, welcome back. We're always thankful for you. And something that you could do in return for us that would really help us out is if you could like and subscribe to the channel, like, rate the podcast, all of that good stuff, because that would make us even more thankful than we already. We've got a whole great show lined up for you. We've got a player review. We've got a trade to break down. We've got a hiring that's super interesting. And we're going to talk about all of that. So let's get started with our player review. And that is for one of the Rays' marquee names. Someone that won an RBLR Rays award. Zach handed the almost Cy Young award to this man, and that was Shane McClanahan. Shane McClanahan, ace of the staff, the lefty, put up another excellent year, but was unfortunately cut short due to injuries. I want to, first of all, pass the ball to you, Remy. How did you feel about Shane McClanahan's 2023?
Well, first off, I wanted to say that he's a power-oriented, pronation biased left-handed pitcher, so he's going to be able to throw fastball really hard. You're going to get a ton of different movement with it. He's a two-time All-Star. 2022, he started the All-Star game, and this year he was also an All-Star. In my opinion, he was much better last year than he was this year, because I think that more often than not this year he found himself just behind in counts and really struggling with walks. What he does well, he's got an elite width and chase rate, elite extension, really good changeup in terms of run value and movement, and he's got a great velocity and shape on his fastball.
I think that's an excellent summary. I think even though Shane McClanahan was, getting all of the accolades that you could do through your first 100 innings of a season, starting the All-Star game for the second straight year, putting up good numbers, and was definitely in contention for Cy Young before he went down with Tommy John surgery that'll leave him out for all of 2023 and all of 2024. He was putting up, if we're going to look at just the basic numbers, through 115 innings, he had a 3.29 ERA. He had a 9.47 K per nine, which is pretty good, but also his 3.21 walks per nine was not quite as ideal as you'd want. Pretty much all of his kind of on the surface numbers got a little bit worse than last year. He was, like you said, behind in counts, walking more people, and therefore his FIP went up by almost a whole run. His xFIP went up by 1.2 runs. He had xERA in the fours, and of course his regular ERA for regular Joes is almost 0.8 runs higher. So everything was going a little bit worse. He was still very, very good, but not quite the elite level that we've come to expect from him. And do you reckon it's simply just because he was falling behind in the counts, or is there something a little more to that?
I think it's a really good question, because I feel like the pitch clock, and I mean, I don't have the stats right in front of me to talk about his year-to-year change in terms of pitch tempo, which is a new stat on Baseball Savant. But I just really noticed that he struggled with walks. I think that some of his pitch shapes were tweaked, like he was throwing the curveball harder. So like overall, I think he should have been better. And I remember one game that he had against the White Sox in which he had 32 whiffs in one night, which is just like insane. I think it was like one of the highest whiffs recorded in like the last like 5 or 6 years. But I think
Wow.
it was just really like an overall struggle with health. Give me 1 second. But I think that, yeah, this year he had two separate IL stints, and the last one was fatal, right? Or not fatal, but
Hmm.
it was way more serious
May as well have been fatal for 2024, that's for sure. Yeah,
to the Rays
Shane.
playoff chances.
Yeah, Shane is a really great arm. We know that he's excellent at getting those swings and misses, picking up a ton of strikeouts. That 92nd percentile whiff rate is insane, as is the 84th percentile chase rate. He throws the ball super hard, and I know that means that his command can sometimes come at a cost like that. And he was I don't want to make a direct comparison to other pitchers, but there seems to be an archetype of the, hey, you're not going to make contact against this guy, but when you do, you're going to hit the ball hard. Similar to kind of Justin Verlander when he was in his prime with the Astros. He didn't give up much, but when he did, it was a home run. And I think that's where Shane kind of falls himself into. It's hard to project Shane McClanahan into the future just simply because Tommy John puts you out for such a elongated amount of time, and it also means we don't know if his velocity is going to be there or if the grip's going to be quite as strong to generate that spin rates. So let's focus on this year. Zach gave him the Almost Cy Young Award. If he continued on his trajectory for the rest of this year, he probably would have been in the top 3, but I don't know if he would have been able to turn it on quite as much as Garrett Cole did down the stretch, simply because Shane McClanahan has yet to really put together a full healthy season where he doesn't tire out before the end of the season. And this is something we've got to ask about Shane McClanahan, and it's the same question we're asking about Tyler Glasnow. How much can we invest in such a high quality arm when he's on, but struggles to stay on the field without tiring? Do you think there's value still?
Well, I'm honestly, you make a really good point, and I was looking at the injury history just because I was curious myself. So September of 2021, his season was ended with low back tightness. In August of 2022, left shoulder impingement completely knocked him out. And then obviously this year he suffered mid back tightness, which kept him out for a little bit. And then the left forearm tightness on the outside of the forearm completely ended his year. So there's definitely a lot of value when he's healthy. But I think just like with other Rays pitchers, the uh, high stuff, low command, in a sense, profile, which is cheaper, is also
Hmm.
runs into way more injury risk. So it's like, how do you counterbalance, right? How do you kind of figure those things out? And he definitely has value when healthy, but it's like, how do we get him back to being healthy?
That's the big question, and that's a question that the Rays have been pondering all season across their entire staff. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Something that I do want to praise about Shane is, despite the peripherals going a little bit low, they are still really high quality overall. He still, I would say, is probably a top 10 starter in at least the American League, if not the big leagues. I think he is an ace when he is on. And something that I want to give credit to, and this isn't the most analytical take, but something that Shane did really well this season, and I think it's been growing more and more ever since his debut, is he has been developing that dog in him. He has been really, really clutch. In fact, I mean, something that blew my mind was Shane McClanahan's left on base percentage this past season. He left 81.7% of runners he got on base. And that feels almost a bit like Blake Snell-ish from this year, where Blake Snell will put a ton of runners on, but you know what? When push comes to shove, they ain't scoring. And that's something that's super valuable to have as a kind of, if you're going to have to go long into games, you're going to have to get out of your own situations. And that's what an ace does. So it proves that he has the personality, the mental toughness to work out of his own jams that he is creating with the occasional blip in command. So that's something that's super, super encouraging. And if he's really good out of the stretch, that's also just a great skill to have as well. In fact, in front of all American League starters that pitched at least 100 innings, Shane McClanahan had the second highest left on base percentage. Only Tyler Wells of the Orioles had more, but Shane McClanahan, super, super clutch. And I know clutch is a stat that, well, not a stat, and that's what makes it so controversial around baseball analysis. But he definitely came through when it mattered this season. What else have you got to say about Shane?
Well, I mean, you kind of pointed out already with Blake Snell. This is funny, right? He's
Hmm.
another former Rays guy, but the Rays draft, or rather, there's also a trend with certain left-handed starters being successful. They'll have these power curveballs and decent changeups, really power curveballs and power fastballs. Like look at like Blake Snell and Cole Reagans and Shane McClanahan. These guys are really good. And as you're saying too, like they'll create tons of whiffs. Blake Snell just leaving like tons of guys on base, which is pretty interesting because he also walks a ton. But yeah, I mean, overall, Shane had I thought he had a really good season, and he definitely he stood up to what the Rays asked of him, which was give us a lot of quality innings pitched, be a leader. He did all of that, and eventually got injured, but that's not really his fault.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I started a bit too harsh on Shane. I think I started a little too hard on him just because the numbers were down across the board. But don't get it twisted. He was still awesome. And I think it's just because after 2022, the expectations are so high for Shane McClanahan now that if he's not a top 3 starter in all of baseball, we're like, Shane, get it together. But actually, he was still really, really awesome. Yeah, and one last question. I don't know if you've had time, Remy, to have a look at his changeup and what makes it so awesome, but his off-speed run value, according to Baseball Savant, 97th percentile. So his changeup is among the best in the game. What makes that changeup so effective?
Yeah, I mean, I remember. I think there was a Pitching Ninja interview with him, or there was another tweet I saw, but what he does is so he has a split changeup grip, or it's closer to a splitter than it is a split changeup. And what he does is he'll pronate to get to the inside of the ball, which creates that kind of like it has very high spin efficiency, which is interesting. Like typically split changeups won't have too high of a spin efficiency, but he's able to just really kill a lot of uh a lot of vert, right? He gets a ton of depth with it, and it's able to just get a lot of arm side run, as you can see just on the Savant uh, break versus average. But that's one thing he does that's really good. He'll just kill a ton of different or a ton of vert and get a ton of arm side run. I was gonna actually ask you a question. It's like it's interesting, or rather, it's an interesting note is that we looked at the Rays rotation coming into this season with potentially 3 to 4 Cy Young candidates, and it's no slouch in Shane, but it's just really interesting to see like how a lot of those guys got injured. You have Shane McClanahan who got injured. Eflin spent time in the IL. Glasnow with his oblique strain, and obviously Jeffrey Springs and Drew Rasmussen both suffering ligament surgeries. But this, when healthy, is definitely a top 3 rotation baseball, maybe the best.
Yeah, I completely agree. And me and Zach talked about this a few weeks ago, where we were kind of pondering whether or not the Rays need to kind of shift tactics in order to take bets on more reliable health with their pitchers, because they do take risks on pitchers that have an injury history or create or are at risk for injury because of the way that they throw or the amount of velocity that they generate and torque on their elbow. They do take risks on those guys, and I pondered whether or not they should change philosophy on that. And the conclusion we came to was no, because it's worked for them so far, and just one particularly bad season should not create a large enough reaction to shift a whole organizational philosophy. I think Zach said, why have a philosophy if one bad outcome is going to change the philosophy altogether? So it's an interesting conundrum, and I think it's something that's been plaguing Rays fans' mind. And I think they're completely correct to wonder about whether or not the Rays have the right tactics in their pitching selection. But their pitchers have been so good this year, and every other year, pretty much since they shifted to being the Rays in 2008, that it would be crazy to let one particularly outlier bad health season change the whole focus. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a really good point. And I mean, just going back to Shane McClanahan, he had Tommy John when they drafted him, or before, right? At USF, he
Yeah.
suffered Tommy John already. Look at Rasmussen. I think this is his second and a half Tommy John surgery. And the Rays will take risks on guys like that. Let me think.
Yeah.
Also, like Pete Fairbanks, Glasnow. I think this is his first. Springs didn't have an injury history. But Zach Eflin, he's had troubles with his knees for a while. And I think even Savale last year and this year, he suffered a little bit of injury concerns. But the one thing that is good about injury concerns is that the guys are cheaper, right? And the
Yeah.
Rays do struggle with payroll, so that does help. But at the same time, I would say that there might be a correlation. I don't know this for certain. Maybe like Ben Whitelaw or someone else would know. But the correlation between stuff and injuries, I would assume that there is one, just looking at these guys on paper.
Yeah, I think so. I think a study definitely needs to be done on that, and that's something we need to look deeper into if there is a correlation. I mean, Jacob deGrom is probably, if there was like a line going upwards on stuff versus injury, Jacob deGrom would be at the top of both axes, right? Because he's like the best stuff, but also the most injury prone. So yeah, it's definitely something that, like, to the eye test, without going deep into it, seems like there could be some kind of correlation. Speaking of correlations, the Rays' former general manager is picking up the phone to the Rays to speak to a familiar face. I don't know if that was the best transition or made the most sense, but just work with me here. Pete Bendix made his first trade as president of baseball operations with the Marlins, and that was with his former team, the Rays, and he managed to acquire Vidal Brujan and Calvin Fauché from the Rays in return for minor leaguers Eric Lara, Andrew Lindsay, and a player to be named later. Starting on the Rays side of things, Brujan and Fauché are both players that have had time on the major league roster. Neither had been particularly successful the past couple of years with the team. Fauché had been DFA'd before the trade went through. Brujan was out of options and never could really cement a place on the roster after struggling with the bat, despite being quite a decent utility infielder. Do you think the Rays are going to feel the pain of the loss of Brujan or Fauché very much?
I think that it's really interesting that the first decision Peter Bendix made, or I guess trade decision, was with his former team. But I think that also speaks of how highly he views Vidal Brujan and Calvin Fauché, right? The Rays, in my opinion, just didn't really have room to carry these guys. Fauché, although he's got really interesting stuff, in the injury history and the lack of command kind of has put him out on the roster. And Brujan, he doesn't have any more options. And there are guys like Aslevis Basabe and even Junior Caminero coming up who could potentially fulfill utility roles. So in Miami, they have a penchant for developing pitching, so they can always help out Fauché, and they don't really have a util guy. So getting Vidal and hopefully getting him solid playing time is a great move for their team.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you make a great point about Brujan and Fauché both having potential to still being contributors at the major league level. But the thing about the Rays kind of roster setup is really they don't have too many guys that have a crazy high ceiling, but to be on the Rays, the floor is also insanely high. You've got to be completely dependable, completely solid to be in that position player core for the Rays. Paredes, you're not going to move him off at third base. You're not going to move Brandon Lau off at second base. And Taylor Walls is so good with the glove that it's going to be really hard to get him out of shortstop without a really impressive bat coming through to kind of make the case. Obviously, we don't have the guy that could have pushed Taylor Walls off a shortstop anymore. But Brujan had the opportunity to kind of play in the absence of Brandon Lau, who has been on and off the field because of health, and he never really made the case for him to stay. He batted 151 this year, just never really got anything going. And we had promise of monster speed as well because he was stealing so much in the minor leagues, and that never really panned out at the major league level either. It never got a chance to show itself. So it's just one of those where the infield is super crowded, especially with Caminero, Curtis Mead, Aslevis Basabe also kind of showing in limited time a better and a higher floor than Brujan at this point. And you're right about Fauché, where I think, again, if the Rays were not, competing for a division and were kind of where the Marlins are, where they're kind of like hanging around the fringes of the wild card, they might have spent more time with Fauché, but when results really matter and you're in a division chase, you can only carry your best guys, and Fauché will probably get more of a chance to work out his stuff in Miami. And Miami sent over some players in return. Eric Lara is a middle infielder that came over from signed with the Marlins from the Dominican Republic as an international free agent. He's still only 17, has barely played in organized ball in the US yet. Not really too much to say about him. He's going to be one of those lottery tickets that may, end up being the Junior Caminero kind of like, oh, where did he come from? How did that happen? Type deal. But for now, the jury's kind of still out. Andrew Lindsay, he was drafted last year or this year?
2022.
Yeah, last year. And has some interesting stuff, but didn't quite put a full campaign together in the minor leagues. Have you got much to say about him?
Oh wait, actually, it might have been 2023. So Andrew Lindsay is currently ranked as the 27th best prospect in the Rays system. He's thrown from a 3/4 slot, and he has a hard running fastball with an upper 80s slider as his best offering. Also has a changeup and a curveball, but they're kind of lagging behind those two pitches. The stuff profiled well after he went from bullpen to starting pitcher. He's got kind of a longer arm action, but I think what's really important is he creates very flat vertical approach angle in the fastballs and has a hard slider shape. It really reminds me of Jacob deGrom. When you look at footage, he really looks a lot like Jacob deGrom. He's got low mileage on his arm because he took time off from pitching, and I think he came back with the Tennessee Volunteers this year. And noted this guy is a Twitter user, Mason McRae, who's now hired by the Red Sox, but he had him ranked as his 56th best college starter among Stuff Plus this year with 167.
167 Stuff Plus. That's exciting.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
So, yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So Lindsay could be a real high upside pitching prospect there. And then there's a player to be named later that could potentially come along in the deal. Do you have any ideas of who that could potentially be?
Yeah, I know that Homan Lee, right? A great Rays user, and he was saying that he expects the player to be named later to be a prospect near Rule 5 status. And I think Josh Roberson was the last player to be named later that Miami gave up in a trade with the Rays, and I think that was a Joey Wendell trade. So I have three guys that I've been kind of looking at. Evan Fitterer, who I know is R5 eligible this year, or eligible. There's also Matt Pushard and Ike Buxton. But I like Fitterer because he reminds me of like Kyle Hendricks. He's got pretty good command with like pretty decent stuff. I think he's a supinator because like the profile has his fastball is like sinking and cutting. His changeup's pretty good, but the curveball and the slider can blend. So I think that potentially like adding a sweeper or toying around with some other pitches and doing some rotational drills will like really help him in his stuff explode and getting him in zone. Pushard has a power fastball with like 2-plane movement and high spin curveball that sounds really good. Like the scouts just rave about it. It's kind of comparable to something called the death ball, which is just like a death ball, which is something that Tread Athletics kind of came up with. It's like a harder curveball with gyro spin, so it's going to get like a ton of depth at a high velocity. And then the last guy is Buxton, who's a converted catcher. He relies on a huge power sinker, and he also has like a slower slider, decent changeup, and kind of bad command. But those guys are all like really interesting. They're on the lower end of Miami's farm system, and they're only a Rule 5 eligibility.
That's a lot of good stuff. Listen, the Death Ball is the greatest pitch name I have ever heard. I did not know of the Death Ball until just this moment, and now it's all I can think about. I'm going to need a lot. I'm going to need a timeout to go think about the Death Ball, and I'm going to have to go look at like video comps of the Death Ball in action because that sounds amazing. If you want your pitch mix to be as devastating as the Death Ball, sorry, let me start that again. If you want your clothing mix to be as devastating as the Death Ball, then you're going to need to head over to shop.rblrsports.com to go get yourself some amazing apparel. You can get yourself a t-shirt, you can get yourself a hat. I've been sporting the Bring Back the Devil t-shirt, getting loads of great looks from people over in the UK. They're like, hey, I don't know who the Rays are, but now I'm interested. And you guys could tell everybody how much you want to bring back the devil in terms of the Rays by going to shop.rblrsports.com and using promo code FLAPPY for 10% off of everything. And you will have the greatest projection for your fashion choices. And speaking of projections, we need to talk about Zips projections. Fangraphs every year put out what is called Zips projections. It's essentially their predictions for how everyone is going to perform in the coming season. They tend to put these out pretty early, but they put a lot goes into these Zips projections, and they project pretty much every stat, including WAR, and then from there predict standings, wins, losses, all of these things. And it's always interesting if a bit of a crystal ball horoscope exercise, and you can put as much or as little faith in it as you want. The Rays one is super interesting because Rays projections tend to be very conservative. Simply because the Rays do not tend to field many absolute superstars on their team. They always field a bunch of high floor guys, but also not too high ceiling guys. And therefore, the projections don't really know what to do, and the Rays are often great at performing greater than the sum of their parts. But this year, they were slightly higher on the Rays than they have been in years past. They usually project the Rays to be a bit of a middling team. But as of right now, assuming the offseason ended today, which it absolutely would not, there's so much stuff to happen. But if the offseason ended today, apparently the Rays would win the AL East. So that's a first, I think, in Rays projection history. The Rays are projected to win the AL East. But essentially, nobody's projected to be particularly great this year. The way that they map it out is pretty much the entire Rays position player core is somewhere between 2 and 3 wins. Paredes has 3.1, Pinto has 1.5. The rest are between 2 and 3. I mean, I think that's really interesting that after the year Yandy Diaz has, they're projecting just a 2.9 WAR season. They're projecting him to get less hits than Randy Arozarena. They're not projecting very much for Yandy Diaz at all, which is super weird. And then on terms of the pitching projection, they think Eflin will be our best starter. They think 3.1 WAR for him. Glasnow 2.8, Savali 1.9, Littell 1.1, Bars 0.9, Bradley 1.8. So nobody particularly going crazy there. And then the bullpen, they predict that they'll have about 4.9 WAR as a collective. Some interesting choices here. Is there anything that you particularly agree or disagree with on these Zip standings?
I think it's really interesting to see that Zips, like for once, the win projection are actually in the Rays' favor, right? Like just in general, the Rays are a very hard team to predict when it comes to like public stats, moves, ideas, etc. As you said, they're projected to be the second best team in the MLB with a 99-63 record behind the Braves, who are going to be 104-58. Rays just overperform projections. But I also think that this projection this time around speaks to the strength of both the Braves and the Rays. They have solid cores, and maybe it's more about the organization at this point. Like the Rays will make really astute moves that other teams don't. And I guess Zips for once is considering that. I don't really know exactly what goes into the statistic because I don't know too much about Zips, but it's interesting to see the Rays looked at favorably for once.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What they say about the Rays in terms of their hitter-player core is they are the crown holders, and they have usurped the Cardinals at this, of being the solid everywhere, unspectacular everywhere. And maybe there's value in that, where they go, well, there's no real dead zones in this lineup, apart from maybe Taylor Walls. The rest, you're going to get a solid AB from. You're going to get a solid contribution from. Everyone's just a solid ball player. And, there'll be some guys that overperform that. They inevitably will. I think they're particularly conservative on Josh Lowe only being 2.3 WAR projected. I think Josh Lowe showed a ton of potential last year, and it would be really strange for him to kind of take a step back. So I would be confused if that happens. And also they on the graphic that they showed, they said if Wander Franco plays shortstop, 4.3 WAR. If he doesn't, they don't even put a number; they just go way less.
Yeah.
So that's a fun point. And also, apparently, they are usually quite aggressively high on a bullpen, but this year they're not. Apparently, they're not particularly jazzed about the kind of fringe of the roster relievers. So they really like Fairbanks, Adam Poche, Kittredge, Clevenger, Kelly Armstrong. But they're like, I don't really know what's going on the fringes of the bullpen. And this is where I think Zips happens too early, because the Rays tend to put that kind of fringe part of the bullpen together right near the end of the offseason with a ton of minor league deals and kind of unremarkable trades that you won't even think about until suddenly that reliever's putting up shutdown eights where he strikes out the side in 12 pitches. So it's kind of I don't know. Zip's predictions. It's hard to put too much faith in them, but we were talking about, like you said, organizational philosophy and how much that can affect things. And I think Kevin Cash is a top 3, if not the best manager in baseball. I know Craig Counsell gives him a run for his money, but if it's not Craig Counsell, it's probably Cash for my money. I think his effective management probably adds a couple of wins over the course of a season. And I also think the clubhouse culture and kind of camaraderie of the team is an intangible you can't measure. And that probably adds like 2 wins to a season, because when vibes are good, it's much easier to play baseball and turn up and give your best effort to a baseball game. And that's something no stat can measure. And these guys are undoubtedly super close, super resilient, have the right mentality, because the amount of adversity they faced last season and the amount they overcame last season, that is, the amount of comebacks they made from being down, the amount of injuries they overcame, the Wander Franco debacle, the fact that they played one of their best stretches of baseball immediately after that happening, shows just how mentally tough this team is. And that will account for some wins, even if you can't measure that over the course of a season. And maybe Zips are starting to take in that, but otherwise it's just a hard thing to read. And I think it's particularly odd that they put this in so early in the offseason when like none of the free agents have signed yet. And yeah, so my last kind of thought on Zips is there's no point in reading too much into it until we get there, but it is nice for them to actually project the Rays well for a change.
Well, I mean, you're definitely right about the fringes of the roster. Like the Rays will sign everyone at the last minute, and those guys are going to be really good. Like no one, see, as I said before, no one really knows what the Rays do from a public perspective. Like we can kind of guess and kind of figure things out, but you're not going to know completely, right? Like look at who they traded for this last like Rule 5 deadline or clearing. There was this one catcher I've like never heard of, and he was like a 10th round pick, and I'm like, what are they doing here? But I think that also just speaks to like how good they are in general, and as you said, the philosophy. I'd say for projections in general, it's like definitely good to have like a necessary base or necessary like public baseline just to evaluate a team's performance. It can be wrong, because of randomness or error, but it's very important to predict future performance and see like where these deviations occur. And I would say in general, like Zips gets pretty close to what their projections are or wins are, but the Rays just will overperform because the Rays will do what the Rays do, right? They have all these models and more privately held beliefs that have worked for them for ages.
Yeah, absolutely. And if the Rays are projected to win 99 and they always overperform, we have a very, very fun 2024 season ahead of us. And a news story that will go a long way towards 2024 performance and may have flew under the radar for many was an interesting scenario that played out that started with the Los Angeles Angels. For anyone that doesn't know this story, Troy Percival, former Rays pitcher and more famously with the Angels, Troy Percival, he came in and kind of has conducted an overhaul on the Angels pitching development. He believes it's too analytically focused. He says that the iPads need to go away. You need to look at stuff and get hands-on. So the Angels are kind of going super old school in their approach to pitching development. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'm not so sure. I'm sure you've got some takes on that, Remy. But because of that, they let go of their minor league pitching coordinator, Buddy Carlisle. And Carlisle had a reputation for being, really analytically inclined and definitely on the numbers side of things, but immediately got snapped up by the Rays, who is now their pitching coordinator as part of the team. And I don't know about you, but if I'm the Angels and you let go of a pitching development guy and the Rays immediately like, we need this guy, quick, come to the Rays. You go, oh no, we've missed something here. What have we missed? What makes Buddy Carlisle such a primary target for the Rays?
Well, I mean, as you said, it's like I think I saw this on Twitter. It's like if the Rays get one of your players, you know you're screwed. If they
Yeah.
get one of your coaches and promote that coach, then you really did something wrong. Buddy Carlisle, as you said, right? Troy Percival, he kind of comes in. I think he was a coach at UC Irvine. It was either UC Irvine or UC Riverside, and he didn't really appreciate how analytics were being used in the Los Angeles Angels farm. And as you said, Carlisle was the coordinator and was fired after this opinion was shared. I think it was like one of the last days before the offseason. So
Mm.
just from what I've heard, there was an interview with Tread with the former Angels pitching performance coordinator named Ryan Croton, and he discussed I thought it was a really interesting pitching philosophy in which the Angels were trying to draft healthy pitchers due to biomechanical analysis. And I don't necessarily
Mm.
know what Carlisle's specialty is. I'm assuming it's somewhere around that field. But if he has any sort of information or experience that he can give to the Rays brain trust regarding pitcher health and, as you said, with analytics and increasing effectiveness, I think this is a perfect addition. And he even got promoted. So he's a very interesting guy. He assisted with Reed Detmer's and Patrick Sandoval's mini breakouts in 2022. But I just really like what he does overall.
Yeah, and that's a super interesting take about the biomechanical kind of looking how to project health from a biomedical kind of standpoint. And maybe that is a subtle shift in philosophy in what the Rays are doing, like we talked about earlier, with maybe they take less risks on those injury prone guys or have some kind of secret sauce in terms of like looking deeper into projecting which pitchers are more likely to stay healthy. That will serve the Rays big time going forward, because if there is one kind of chink in their armor as an organization, is they do deal with a lot of pitching injuries. So if they're looking to kind of shore that up with a guy like Buddy Carlisle, who has some insider information on that, that is a super smart hire. And I think, honestly, it looks like the Angels are in for a real grim time going forward in terms of not just their on-field products at the major league level, but also their development is also looking a bit bleak in the long-term future, because obviously they traded away a lot of their good prospects at the deadline to try and go for it, and that went nowhere. And they ended up getting rid of all their players, and then they are getting rid of all their analytics guys in the back end. So it's a bit worrying if you're the Angels, but I guess is there you're a pitching analyst yourself. Do you think there is any truth to what Percival is saying, in that maybe you need to zag where everyone else is zigging and need to kind of be more hands-on and get the iPads or the TrackMan away?
I think that there is value in what he's saying. I mean, it's kind of two parts. Like, I do believe that his experience as a coach, he knows what he's talking about. At least, like, also just different forms of learning. Some people are more like kinesthetic learners, so they're more hands-on. Some people are more visual and auditory. I think that it is definitely good to get reps in and kind of feel things out and get on the mound and try new things. But it's also super important to have data. You need to have data to understand the equation, right? To try and complete what gaps of knowledge that are out there. And I mean, look at what the Rays are doing. They believe in data, they believe in what they're doing. So they'll go and snap up a guy like Carlisle, who definitely has something that they're missing. And they're going to use that to kind of factor into their equation. So it's not about getting rid of one for the other. It's definitely a balance of having both Percival's take, which is we need to get more people like on the mound and just having more experience, but also you need the analytics of Carlisle in order to understand like what's happening, right? Like most pitchers can't just tell you, yeah, I was leaking like 30 degrees of rotational energy or something. Like obviously they're not going to know that.
Yeah, I completely agree. As a school teacher myself, everyone learns, like you said, in different ways. And something the Rays have received a lot of credit for in years past from former Rays when they talked about their experience with the Rays is that they are fed a ton of information from the front office. The front office just floods them with so much data. But what the coaching staff do really, really well is make all that data simple and understandable for pitchers. And each pitcher or player in general has a different amount of mileage in terms of how much information they can take on in terms of numbers and, spin rates and all that kind of stuff. But essentially what Kyle Snyder and the rest of the development staff do is they make that understandable and tangible for the players so that they just go, okay, let's not get into the weeds on that. What this is all basically saying is you need to throw your sweeper more, or you need to, your slider's really good, so throw that more, or whatever. That's a really simple example, but they are doing that all across the board. And I think that's what the Rays do best. And yeah, you're probably right that the more voices you have, the closer you're going to get to the best solution, because the amount of personalities you have on a team, you need to hear information in different ways. And putting all that together is probably the best solution, but I think absolutely you need each part to be a contributor if it's going to be effective. And if the Angels are saying we don't need the TrackMan part of it, or that we don't need the real data driven part of it, then they're missing half the equation. And the eye test is only so much. So I think the Rays are doing the right thing here. I'm super excited to see what Buddy Carlisle's effect is going to be. We probably won't be able to put a kind of tangible measure on it until a few years down the line, but it's a super exciting hire. Because when the Rays get aggressive about a member of staff, or a player, it's always super exciting, and the other team should really, look inward and go, "Uh-oh, what have we done here?" So I think that is all we have time for here on the RBLR Rays show. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your Thanksgiving weekend. And we can't wait to talk more Rays, and hopefully we'll have some fun and exciting things to break down for you next week as well. Be sure to keep it locked on to RBLRRays.com, RBLRsports.com, and we'll see you next time. Rays up.
Thank you for tuning into this presentation by RBLR Sports. On your way out of the stadium, please remember to like and subscribe.